The subject, this is about managing employees in the age of artificial intelligence. It's a subject that those of us working in the world of employment law and HR cannot ignore. No doubt there are some of us who saw it coming, but the access to things like ChatGPT is probably the reason why the rest of us are now really catching up. This seminar, unlike any of the others in our series, is one that doesn't have a lot in the way of new law or cases to talk about. But what we want to do is give you an overview of how the legal and HR worlds are currently viewing the developing use of AI at work. Like I said, we've packed an awful lot into 30 minutes. I'll be talking very fast. I know I do usually anyway. There's detail in the slides, and this is a subject that we're going to be blogging on regularly. So really keep your eyes and ears peeled. So let's talk about what we are really meaning when we talk about artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence is essentially technology that can process large amounts of data at speed. And the really important point is that it's a level beyond human ability. What AI can't do, and this is what's important for us, is it can't make ethical or moral judgments. It can't consider the broader social, cultural, ethical implications of its decisions, and it can't use common sense or intuition in the way that humans can do. It's in everyday life. There's some examples on the slides, but I thought I should tell you that the invitation that you got to this webinar was produced using ChatGPT. I just told it what I wanted to cover, and it produced the text. I have to say, it didn't involve an awful lot of tweaking, so it's beginning to scare us all, I suspect. You will hear the term generative AI. Just go back one second. Generative AI, large language model. ChatGPT is effectively generative AI, but it's a large language model which effectively uses natural language processing, and it can do things like classify text, analyze text, and Will's going to talk a bit more about that particular subject. You'll also hear me referencing data protection impact assessment and equality impact assessments, and really there's no science to those. It's just a systematic assessment of the impact of the introduction of some form of AI technology on groups, workers, certain types of rights. We can't cover every facet of AI in the world of employment today, but we thought we would divide this up into three main sections. So we've got changing the shape of workforces. I did say I would cover that. I'm not going to cover it in a lot of detail, but I'm going to flag a recent report on the subject. We're then going to spend a bit more time talking about people management in AI. So effectively the use of AI by managers to monitor and profile and make decisions about employees. And then we're going to flip it and look at employees' use of AI. And obviously that will include things like ChatGPT, and that's what Will's going to cover. So if we look at changing workforces for a second, if you just flip the slide, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, produced a report in 2023. It's written by economists. I would suggest you read it if you can handle that type of report, but its conclusions are extremely interesting. Obviously, it's macro, so it's not specific to the UK. It looks at roles and types of job across the whole of the world. But what it concludes is really interesting. So it says that the roles that will be most exposed to the impact of generative AI are clerical and administrative. In some respects, that's probably not a big surprise. But what they say is that 28% of activities in the administrative space are highly exposed to automation, and a further 58% moderately exposed. Now, obviously, they have a definition of clerical and administrative work that you need to pay attention to, but those are interesting statistics. What's perhaps more interesting, and I have to say a bit more positive, is what they say about the impact of AI on a whole class of other roles. In fact, most of the other roles that they look at, and they talk about augmentation. In other words, AI being a positive impact or having a positive impact on roles, perhaps leading to a reduction in the number of people we have doing certain types of job, but certainly enhancing our own human abilities. A couple of other points just to highlight the impacts. Their view is that there will be less keenly felt in low-income countries at the moment. That's economically driven, but there will also be, very interestingly, a disparate impact on women, because women occupy a much larger percentage of clerical and administrative positions. And finally, they do talk about concerns about the impact of automation on things that we will be worried about, like job quality, experience, and they reinforce the need for engagement with trade unions and employee representative bodies, as is very much the ILO's focus. So let's talk about people management and AI. When we talk about it, we've been talking about big data in HR for quite a long time, haven't we? And we get very excited about the ability to use and the importance of using data to drive management decisions. But of course, we struggle with the idea that it's often inaccurate and it's very slow, and bad data makes bad decisions, etc. But the benefits of AI may well be numerous. Valuable insights into job applicants, workers, workplace processes. It can speed things up. It can lead to quicker decisions, and hopefully also lead to much more consistent decision making as well. And when you look at where AI is being used in the context of people management at the moment, you can see it in 3 separate boxes. They bleed together, but you'll see what I mean. Monitoring and data collection. We do a lot of that already. If you're using AI to manage staff, you need data. The data will come in the form of, we already have data. We have sickness absence data, for instance. That's a form of monitoring. But that then moves into and becomes much more developed when you start using automated systems to create a profile of a person based on an analysis of the data you've gathered, analysis of personal information, personality, behavior, etc. And then the next phase, automated decision making, which may or may not be connected to profiling, but that's when you make a decision on using an automated system, usually with no direct human involvement. So that's how we view it. Now I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but I just wanted to pick out a couple of examples of where it's being used at the moment, or where it's being talked about being used. So one of them is facial recognition technology, where the technology scans the expression of candidates during video interviews. I have to say, I find that very Big Brother-ish. On the other hand, if you look at AI video monitoring to track health and safety hazards, you can see exactly why there would be enormous positive benefit in the use of AI in that context. Some of those things on the slides we already do, and some of them are straying into the new categories of people management AI. So where is the law? Where are we in terms of regulation? Truth of the matter is, we are playing catch up. There is a school of thought that says it's too late, which I find very depressing, but I understand why they're saying that. They're almost saying that the technology is moving so fast that the regulators can't keep up. And you can see exactly why that is when you look at, and Will's going to talk about ChatGPT in a workplace environment. We kind of don't know what to do with it. We have to apply existing legislation that will have a bearing on how we use AI. Some of it is not quite designed for what we need, and it needs to be updated. But the obvious areas in terms of legislation are data protection law, human rights law, anti-discrimination law, and to some extent, or lesser extent, the law relating to interception and monitoring of telecommunications. So the next 3 slides, and I am going to flick through these quite quickly just for the sake of time, but what we've done is we've identified for you what we think are being seen as the key risks in the use of AI in a people management context. The first one is probably the one that's getting talked about most, and that's bias and discrimination. And Will's going to talk, and I will both talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But that really is a result of the fact that AI is only as reliable as the data that it's fed. And if that's flawed or it contains a bias, then the system itself can perpetuate the issue. Inaccurate predictions, because we're focused on the need for accuracy in any data that we retain, accuracy is likely to be an issue. So for instance, personality profiling, how accurate can that or will that be? And what happens if we as employers hold data that is inaccurate? Transparency is a very big subject. Because profiling processes are opaque and algorithms are usually secret, it's going to be very difficult when an employee says, well, how did you make that decision? Or why did you make that decision about me? And how do I trust that decision? You have to know exactly how the system is working in order to be able to answer those challenges. The next box are really the sort of areas to do with human relations and employee relations and the human dimension of management. Is it really possible for AI to substitute for true people management? There's plenty of people who think that's not possible. It doesn't provide empathy. It doesn't understand personal circumstances. So if you're talking about automated decisions, how do you ever account for people's individual circumstances and how they're feeling at a particular point in time? And equally, in the sense of mental health and well-being, if we become so process-driven and we'd already know what process can do to employee well-being, what's going to happen if we start to abstract that even more and take away human interaction? And reputationally, you'll remember what happened in COVID when employers started to suggest that employees should be letting them see via their cameras what their home environment office setup looked like. And there were howls of protest about that and sort of monitoring people's activity online. Employers find that difficult in terms of reputation. So how are you going to manage that? And lastly, in terms of the risks, these is where you start to get into slightly more legal concepts. You've got data protection, human rights law. Data protection law isn't going to stop us from using AI, but there are going to be limits. We've got the respect for private life and family life, which also has a bearing on the types of AI that we might consider. The Investigatory Powers Act, to a limited extent, depending on monitoring. And trust and confidence obviously goes back to that point about how do we instill confidence in our employees when we're making decisions, and how does that play into the law relating to trust and confidence. Going back to bias and discrimination for a moment, this is a scenario which I think some of you probably will have seen in the papers, but I'll just run through it so that it kind of highlights why we're talking a lot about bias and discrimination in this environment. It's a good example of what happens when you try to use some of those systems that I was describing in the table earlier on in the slides. Amazon developed its recruitment engine to screen job applicants, and the machine learning specialist discovered that the software was favoring men over women. And the AI had taught itself to prefer the CVs of men over women. And the reason it had done that was because what it was being fed were the CVs that had been submitted over the previous 10 years, the majority of which were from men. So it was screening out based on what it understood to be right. Amazon tried to fix it, they failed, and they are back to square one. It's not to say that this isn't going to happen and we're not going to carry on trying to use these. It's just there is the example of how the discrimination arose, and Will, as I said, is going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. Data protection, again, I don't have time to go into all of this. I am not a data protection lawyer, as you probably all know, but the two things I would highlight off this slide in terms of data protection at the moment is that if you're being offered products from your data protection team, your IT team, and that they look immediately shiny, just remember that a lot of these providers will say, well, we give you the platform, but everything else, all the legal side is up to you. So they're not selling a product that is automatically vetted in terms of its legal compliance. That's your responsibility. So please do remember that. You will find yourselves as HR people in particular working very, very closely with your DP teams. It really, in many respects, the DP teams will probably take the lead on a lot of this stuff, but obviously from an employment perspective, there's a big role for HR in this. Also remember, we're not working in a world of consent here. So you're not going to go and get consent for this processing. That's not what we do in the world of employment and data protection. You're not relying on that. What you have to do is make sure that what you've done is proportionate. And of course, the mechanism to check that is a data protection impact assessment. Next slide. A quick word on future protection. Where are we going? This is very interesting. The UK at the moment, the signal is that we're going to get guidance, not regulation. Now, I don't know how long they're going to be able to maintain that stance, and I'll tell you why. First of all, we've got private members bill going through, supported by Labour, which effectively attempts to regulate the use of AI tech on a fairly limited basis in the workplace at the moment. Not sure whether that's going to get support. Looks like not at the moment. That contains effectively three main principles: anti-discrimination principles, ensuring that workers have a say, on the use of technology, and allowing workers to understand how their data is being used in the context of IA. So that's what the private members bill actually contains. The government have said they are going to tweak data protection law. Maybe they'll do that and incorporate some of that in the bill. It's not clear, but what is clear is that we're going to end up with a head-to-head between the UK and EU on this, because the EU, who now of course set the global standard for data protection, they are taking really quite a different approach to this, and quite a radical approach. And in the employment sphere, we're seeing effectively the impact of a tier of risks that they will align with particular types of processing. So for instance, any form of social scoring, classifying people based on behavior or personal characteristics, is going to be unacceptable. Emotional recognition systems in the workplace, unacceptable. So that the one that I was talking about in relation to recruitment in the EU world, unacceptable. And the other obvious indicator of the fact that we're playing catch up is the EU and the US are working on a global emergency global code for the use of AI. And that also is a signal of the fact that it's a global issue. It's not confined to one jurisdiction in any way, shape or form, as we already know, but the fact that they're having to think about that in an emergency context and produce regulations and a code of conduct is really very interesting. So finally, slide from me very quickly. If you're sitting in the sort of fairly basic stages of this at the moment, what are you looking at? You're looking at an ABC of a process, an approval process before any AI is adopted. That will obviously be working very closely with your DP team, as I've already said. Being clear who's making decisions, making people aware of how to follow a process if they want to introduce some form of AI in the workplace, carrying out those impact assessments. If they're properly done, they should properly highlight the issues, the circumstances in which the use of AI is going to impinge on rights that are already in play. And communication, telling people. You can see that built into the private members bill as well, telling people what's going on, telling people what you're using the AI for. Those are the basic planks of management of the risks in relation to people management and AI. So I'm going to hand over to Will, who's now going to talk a little bit more about generative AI.
Thanks, Joan, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we see at the moment being generated, but this is not an exhaustive list, and it seems to us that the possibilities are absolutely endless, which is both exciting and I think a little bit terrifying. We're going to look mostly at ChatGPT at the moment because that sort of seems to be the main one that people have heard of and that people are using. It's basically designed to generate human-like responses, whether that be something like a newspaper or a magazine article, whether it be an essay that a student might produce during the course of their studies, anything in the creative industries. And I think many of us on the webinar today will be aware of the strike that's currently going on in Hollywood. That stems from the fact that a lot of actors are concerned about the use of AI by the big studios in using their voices or using their face, where they then don't get either pay or recognition for it. But it could be something simple, like a teacher producing a lesson plan, a doctor producing a letter to a patient. And that sort of goes back to the point that Joan was talking about earlier in the ILO's report, that this doesn't necessarily mean people will disappear. It's not automation only, it's augmentation and assisting people in their roles. In the context of today's seminar, then, HR professionals might use something like ChatGPT to produce a job description. So you could ask it to produce a job description for another HR assistant. It can review an employment contract for you and suggest changes if there's certain things that you want it to do for you in relation to a specific role. It could suggest interview questions for you based on a job description which you feed in. Or, as we'll see in a minute, it can review an employee's grievance and produce a summary or a chronology or risks which you might need to think about. And for reasons that will become obvious in a minute, we would advise against this. On the flip side, though, it could be used by a job applicant to produce their application or their cover letter, or it could be used by an employee to produce the work that they have been tasked to do. Now, the outputs can vary. Some of them are very impressive and can reduce the time that you spend. And we'll come on to the pitfalls as well, where some of it can perhaps be a little bit erroneous. So one of the things we did before this webinar was create a fake grievance, essentially. And without using any of the technical jargon that we're familiar with in the HR sphere, we put together this one. I'm not going to read it out verbatim, but it pulls together somebody working in a factory who's been there for a long time, is complaining about a piece of equipment on a health and safety basis, and they're alleging that they have been given some sort of unfavourable treatment, either by being told that they shouldn't be worrying about this, or that actually other people were offered a role or to apply for a role which they weren't considered for. They also say that the response they were given was, you and your gal pals are always moaning, either about your shifts or the equipment. You never hear any of the blokes complaining. The person then goes on to say that it's caused them stress and anxiety. They're signed off. They've gone to Citizens Advice Bureau. They have no trust and confidence. So we asked ChatGPT, what employment law risks arise in the UK from this scenario? And then the response we got is, I mean, it's very cute in a way. I am not a lawyer, but I can provide some general information. And actually what we're seeing, again, I'm not going to go and read this line by line, but it is teasing out some of the key aspects that we would expect it to do. It is impressive. And bear in mind, I think we're on something like ChatGPT 4 now. It is still in its relative infancy, particularly in this context where you might use it in the workplace. But it is picking out things like discrimination. So the bit about the gal pals and always moaning, and it says it could be gender discrimination. It picks up the health and safety concern. Now, it doesn't go as far to say anything like this could be whistleblowing or the terminology we use, protected disclosures, that sort of thing. So it's not necessarily as advanced as you might expect, but it then picks up things like constructive dismissal. So when we talked about trust and confidence, it's clearly scraping data and understanding what it thinks the key issues are. However, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in some of the other slides, it picked up victimization, which for those of us who are familiar with all of the provisions of the Equality Act, that requires detriment or some sort of less favourable treatment based on somebody's protected characteristic. It hasn't really linked the two here because it starts talking about the health and safety rather than protected characteristics, of which we know there are 9. So it is something that you need to still be aware of and use with caution. But you can see, as I say, how sort of detailed this is, and that it is picking up on what we would expect to be some of the key considerations. So what are the risks of using generative AI? It lacks insights. So Joan already mentioned, it doesn't have empathy. But it can't also judge what it's being fed or what it is looking at. So it scrapes masses of data and then reports what it finds as fact. That can then be unreliable. And actually what it can do is it can hallucinate and it can produce something which actually isn't a fact at all. And there was an example of that recently in the US where a solicitor came a cropper by referring to cases which ChatGPT had produced in support of their arguments, which not only were they not helpful, they actually didn't exist. They were completely fictitious. I think the solicitor actually, or their firm rather, ended up being fined. So you can see where it can go wrong. It can also be outdated. Now, as I said, I think the current version is GPT-4, but if you were using a previous version, and I've put here ChatGPT 3, which has a knowledge cutoff of September 2021, so it's only really as good as the point in which the software you're using has been trained to. And with something like employment law and HR practices, where we know cases are coming out daily, things are changing, legislation gets put in place at lightning speed compared with perhaps other areas of the economy, this is something which we see as a potential limitation. And then again, in terms of generative AI, confidentiality and data protection, so you can't guarantee that what you put in won't then be used to train the system on something else, or that it might be spat out in response to something else. Now, there are options you can take to try to get it not to do that, but there's no guarantee at this stage that won't happen. And I suppose what you would want to ensure is that employees aren't putting in personal data of other staff into this if it then becomes publicly available, either as a search or being spat out in response to somebody else's search or request. It's vulnerable to hacking. And also there's the ability for bias to be built in. So as Joan mentioned when we were talking about automated decision making in the Amazon case, actually, and we'll come on to this in a video, there is the possibility that the generative AI, what it produces based on what it scrapes and what it assesses, will then produce something either stereotypical or worse, discriminatory. There's also quite a few issues around intellectual property, and there are quite a few, mostly in the US again, cases being filed by people who are saying that their copyright or their intellectual property has been used by ChatGPT in order to either produce images, produce creative works, or produce responses or documents to things, and that shouldn't be happening. So where that ends up, and this goes directly back to the point Joan was making, that regulating this and regulation is really behind. We don't know where this is going yet. And then there's the reputational risk. On the one hand, if you've got a team of people who have been producing some sort of promotional material and they've used generative AI in that and it all goes swimmingly, perhaps there's no problem. But what if it spits out something that isn't right and perhaps somebody hasn't sense checked it, and then it turns out that actually it's either inaccurate, offensive, discriminatory? Where does that lead you? Can you tell if something has been generated by AI? The short answer is it really varies. For example, if you're just asking it to produce a job description, or as Joan said, we asked it to produce a webinar invite, you probably wouldn't notice. It's not yet at the stage, although we think it will get there pretty quickly, of being able to generate completely lifelike images or videos of people. People on the webinar today will most likely be familiar with the term deep fakes, and these are becoming more and more impressive and more prevalent. Restricted learning is also an issue which we see coming down the horizon. So what if staff, particularly your junior staff, are using it in replacement to actually learning or doing? And actually, how good are you going to be at spotting that? Are you going to know if somebody has drafted something or if they've used ChatGPT? And obviously that depends on your framework, what your monitoring systems are like, how obvious it is, whether there's something on it that says ChatGPT at the bottom. But it is something that we see as a potential issue. And then I suppose some jobs will be enhanced by generative AI. Others might disappear. Others will simply be augmented. But it's very important that you're thinking about, one, how you would use this, and two, what that means then. So going back to Joan's point about impact assessments, what does this mean for your business? So we're now just going to turn to a short video which shows some of the issues we think could be highlighted by the use of generative AI.
This is why you should avoid mixing Barbie with biased AI image generators. What does a typical prisoner look like? What about a lawyer, a nurse, a drug dealer? What about a fast food worker, a cleaner, a terrorist, or a CEO? These are all images created by an artificial intelligence image generator called Midjourney, which creates unique images based off of simple word prompts. These exaggerated biases that AI systems create are known as representational harms. These are harms which degrade certain social groups by reinforcing the status quo or by amplifying stereotypes. A particularly extreme example was created when BuzzFeed published an article of AI-generated Barbies from different countries around the world. The Barbies from Latin America were all presented as fair-skinned, perpetuating a form of discrimination known as colorism, where lighter skin tones are favoured over darker ones. The Barbie from Germany was dressed in clothes reminiscent of an SS Nazi uniform, and the Barbie from South Sudan was depicted holding a rifle by her side. We need to be educated and intentional about how we use AI image generators. As computer scientist and digital activist Joy Balamwini puts it, whether AI will help us reach our aspirations or reinforce unjust inequalities is ultimately up to us. What are some examples of representational harms you've come across recently?
So, I mean, it's a fairly dramatic video, but I think it gets across the point that actually what we're talking about here is something that has not gotten a human input. So a lot of the data that it's scraping will be created by humans, but it is then making an assessment and a judgment and generating something at the end, which it thinks most closely fits whatever it's being asked to do. And you can see just how quickly that can then result in something which could lead to reputational risk and legal risk. So just a fair warning, I think, is the point we're getting at here. So how do you manage those risks? One, carry out a risk assessment. How are you going to be using it? What are the benefits for your organization? Do you need to consult with your staff about how you're going to use it? What's the crossover with your other policies? The most obvious ones, things like your use of IT, data protection. And then tell your staff, as Joan said, transparency is key here. Communicate your rules and your policy and review it regularly. This is changing at lightning speed and we don't think it's really going to stop. It's only really going to get more advanced. So make sure that you're keeping on top of however you're using it. And in terms of a framework you might use, we call it policy, but really it will vary dramatically depending on what your organization does and how you intend to deploy any AI, not just generative. Make sure it's understandable, so avoid the use of jargon if you can. Consider insisting employees use their work devices when using this. It allows you to monitor the usage. Get workers to opt out of the prompts where GPT might train on the data they put in. Risk assess the tasks that people are and aren't allowed to use artificial intelligence for, and make clear that the data they must not input, so personal data, particularly sensitive personal data, anything which can identify an individual. Consider the impact on any intellectual property rights, yours, somebody else's, a third party's, and then seek approval from senior management before something is finalized. So make sure there is some sort of human step or human element involved, particularly with what is generated at the end. Consider having labeling so that it's clear what has been generated by artificial intelligence and what hasn't. How are you going to train people on its use? Are you going to make that mandatory? And then make clear what the consequences for failing to adhere to a policy are, i.e. disciplinary action. And then just a final slide to let you know that we've put some information up on our HR portal workbox, which covers lots of what we've discussed today, and obviously will continue to be curated, and we'll pull together a sort of framework which we think will cover off the points I've just discussed on the last slide. So I think we're actually at 1 o'clock just now. So as Joan had predicted, we've unfortunately run out of time for questions, but we will have a look in the chat function and we can follow up on those as required. But thanks everyone for listening and for attending today.